For most of my working life, I've been making films about the military history of the Third Reich for TV channels all around the world. I've written 9 books on the subject. I've visited the battlefields, I've delved into the plans of the generals and explored the miseries of the foot soldiers. It soon became clear to me that the demonised figure of Adolf Hitler lurked behind everything that I'd worked upon. In the light of the appalling crimes he committed, it's easy to dismiss Hitler as an inhuman monster. In doing that, we forget that Hitler was flesh and blood with human feelings and human frailties. I think that's a common mistake which clouds our understanding of the true nature of human folly. And by taking a personal journey through the surviving sites connected with Hitler, I hope to create the opportunity to really understand him by immersing myself in his world. For once, I wanted to travel alone without the distractions of a film crew. My goal was to concentrate fully on the subject, and I didn't want anything to interfere with the natural flow of the words and thoughts. We should have both come to a better understanding of the circumstances in which Hitler lived and the environmental factors which shaped the man behind the Third Reich. I think it works. I hope you do too. This is where the whole journey begins, on this modest street here in Braunau am Inn. It was here on the morning of April 20th, 1889 that Adolf Hitler was born. Hitler's father was a dedicated customs official by the name of Alois. You won't find any reference to it in the pages of Mein Kampf, but Alois actually changed his name from Schicklgruber to Hitler at the age of 40. The reason for the name change seems to have been tied up with the idea of obtaining a small family legacy. So by the time he came here to Braunau on Inn, Alois had changed his name from Schicklgruber to Hitler, and it was the Hitler family who lived in the house behind me. In keeping with most of the buildings here in what was the former Third Reich, there's virtually nothing to identify a building of this significance for the history of the 20th century. The only marker at this site is a small slab of granite from the quarry at Mauthausen, which is very fitting when we consider how terribly the inmates at Mauthausen suffered under Hitler's regime.
He's 25 years old, this Austrian.
When Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany decrees the war of 1914.
The Kaiser promises, I shall lead you to an era of wonders.
We come now to the Odeonsplatz in the heart of Munich. It was here that Hitler came on a Sunday in 1914 to cheer the outbreak of the Great War. He stood almost exactly where I'm standing now and cheered the speakers standing on the steps of the monument behind me. On hand to record the event was the famous photographer Hoffmann, who stood behind the lion you can see behind my right shoulder there. Hoffmann took a picture into the square of the enthusiastic crowd who were there to celebrate the news that Germany was at war. Hoffmann later discovered that Hitler had been here at precisely the same time, And the two scrutinised the pictures and were able to pick out the picture of Adolf Hitler enthusiastically embracing the idea that at last the open warfare that he'd so long wished for had arrived.
Germany invents new war horrors. First use of poison gas. Frightfulness, they called it then. Flammenwerfer by the Germans. Germany invents air raids, a nightmare legacy for all mankind. Hitler had dreamed of military glory, but again he must resign himself to obscurity.
Along with Germany, his country is defeated.
He is ruined.
And he himself, after 4 bitter years of warfare, has gained nothing but a corporal's stripe. But the ex-Kaiser's era of wonders has turned out to be an age of grinding poverty and chaos.
And it is this situation that gives Adolf Hitler his chance at last.
To avoid their just payments, appropriate punishment for their crime against humanity in 1914,
The Germans resort to inflation.
Money melts like snow.
in 1920 the dollar is worth about 10 marks.
In 1921, 100 marks.
In 1922, 1,000
In
marks.
the spring of 1923, 100,000 marks.
And in the same year, millions and millions of marks, until we reach the astronomical figure of 4 billion marks to the dollar.
Inflation cheats the Allies, but it also brings ruin to Germany.
Hitler has by now become a secret agent. In other words, a spy.
In the service of the Reichswehr.
Hitler has been entrusted with the task of watching the activities of a new political party, the German Workers' Party in Munich.
And while still in the pay of the army, he first joins and then takes the leadership of a very organization he was paid to spy upon.
It was to places like this that Hitler gravitated in the 20s. In Munich here there's a real culture of beer making and beer drinking, and it obviously made for a convivial atmosphere for any speaker. Not only were these places big enough to house a crowd of sometimes as large as 3,000, the ready sale of alcohol obviously created the kind of atmosphere and the kind of warmth of reception for the speaker. There was, of course, a far more sinister edge to what was developing here in the 20s with Adolf Hitler. It was here that the German Socialist Workers' Party really took shape. As Hitler began his round of the very famous beer hall speeches, the Hofbrauhaus is among the most famous, and it was here that Hitler came to speak. In the pages of Mein Kampf, Hitler had described how he felt that the Social Democrats were actually an intimidatory force, and he formed the view that any intimidation had to be met with equal intimidation. And Hitler would start his speeches very quietly, hardly raising his voice, and build up into a crescendo of arm waving and gestures and hysteria, but it was very, very effective. It sounds theatrical and over the top, but in reality Hitler was a mesmeric speaker, and he managed to enfold this huge country in his grasp. Hitler was a gambler. He was always prepared to take a big risk in order to try and achieve an objective. He decided that the time had come to seize power by force of arms. In the famous beer hall putsch which took place here in Munich, Hitler decided to gamble everything on being able to seize his objective by surprise. He decided that the time was ripe for an armed coup de main which took the form of the Munich putsch. The putsch itself was a bit of a hodgepodge affair. They originally seized their prisoners as planned, but thereafter no one seemed to have a clear and coherent idea what to do. There was no proper chain of command, with the result that the army barracks were able to mobilise. Next day, Hitler and his supporters decided that the best thing to do was to march here to the Odeonsplatz and stage a rally which would feature one of Hitler's trademark speeches. They came down the street behind me here, and they were confronted by a cordon of armed policemen. Shots were exchanged, a number of the putschists fell to the ground dead, and effectively that was the end of the beer hall putsch. In the short term, the results were disastrous for Hitler. The party was soon outlawed and its leader imprisoned.
The sentence is 5 years imprisonment in the fortress of Landsberg. But his treatment is by no means severe, and he uses this enforced leisure to write his now famous Mein Kampf,
Germany's Book of Doom.
an avalanche of words.
And promises.
The German loves a uniform.
So Hitler gives out uniforms. Uniforms for everybody.
Uniforms for boys.
Uniforms for girls.
For journalists, for motorists, workmen.
Whole factories are made over to manufacturing Nazi uniforms.
Newspapers are required to spread the doctrine.
Nazi cigarettes are introduced with pictures of the leaders on the cards.
And the factories where the cigarettes are made belong to the party.
The sales of cigarettes, uniforms, arms, insignia, flags bring in over 70 million marks a year.
All profits for the party.
The Nazi Party. Like a quack selling a panacea at a fair, Hitler makes the Germans believe that the Nazi policy is a cure for all their ills.
He promises everything to everybody. And all the time, the big parades go on.
Bigger, but always bigger.
So that the people in their wretchedness, hungry and unemployed, swarm in their thousands into the Nazi organization. The brown shirts become an army, the private army of a single man.
A man who aspires to become dictator of Germany.
Dictator of Europe itself.
This is Dachau, the very first of the concentration camps. The concentration lager were a network of camps that were established very quickly after Hitler had assumed power. In fact, this place was constructed while there was still a coalition government in power. It's a very sobering and quite a harrowing experience, as one would imagine. Something like 250,000 people were incarcerated here. Dachau wasn't what is now known as a death camp. It's estimated that approximately 30 to 40,000 people perished here. Most of that was as a result of disease and starvation. There were, of course, the usual scenes of incredible brutality. if you came through those gates, you'd lost all of your civil rights. There was a popular rhyme at the time which was, "Please make my lips dumb, that I to Dachau may not come." It was widely known that the concentration lager had begun to appear. The purpose at that time was to stifle trade unionism and to stifle intellectuals and opponents of the state. It was some time yet before the Jewish Holocaust, which really began to gather pace from 1941 onwards. Originally, this was the place where anyone who was likely to be an enemy of the state was incarcerated. People were brought here on the premise that this was a short-term measure. The concentration camps, initially the concentration lager, were actually welcomed by the general public. They were seen as a new way of instilling discipline into society, because when you were brought here, it was seen as a short-term measure where work was going to be used in order to modify your behaviour. You would be worked hard, and in the course of that hard work, you would learn how to be a good member of the Third Reich. There was no prospect of a trial. People who were brought here came here really as a temporary measure, and for that reason it was argued there was no need for a trial because you were only here for a short term. Of course, that didn't turn out to be the case, and as mortality kicked in, it was discovered that the special treatment which people were singled out for inevitably meant execution. This was the place where executions could be carried out, bodies could be cremated, and the ashes shovelled into a local ditch, and no one would be any the wiser. This is the main square in Frankfurt, which still has something of the 1930s. Most places have long since gone, and what we're left with is the building behind me, which is the Rathaus. Hitler came here and stood on the balcony behind me and addressed a throng of people in this square. Today it's a placid tourist trap, but at the time it was obviously absolutely thronged with people who were celebrating the Third Reich. Hitler as always gave one of his impassioned speeches from the balcony up there. And it was in towns like Frankfurt where he found a great deal of the support. He was a frequent visitor to the city and spoke to huge audiences in the various complexes around. It's important to realise that when we talk about Adolf Hitler, his agenda was very complex and covered a number of competing ideas. Nationalism obviously was a huge influence on him. Socialism was part of the mix, hence the name National Socialist. But he was also racially motivated and militaristically motivated. So it's a very bad combination of factors that are at work there. And the inevitable result was the dehumanisation that we saw under the Reich. This is a typical structure that Hitler and Speer between them decided should represent the Third Reich. It was flanked by a huge run of columns on either side. Those columns have now gone, but this kind of very neoclassical brutalist style was what Hitler and Speer aimed for.
The swastika of the Nazi Party. It is gone today, blasted from the earth, but the memory of its evil genius remains.
Famous footage of the swastika being blown up over the Zeppelin field is one of the defining images of World War II. It's exactly the kind of building that you would expect to find in a Third Reich site such as this. Very stark, very ordered, and this is not a building that's dedicated to freedom of the will or freedom of the individual. As Riefenstahl described her film, it's very much a triumph of the will. It's about imposing ideas on other people. There is nothing here which is designed to be soft or round or in any way romantic. It's neoclassical, and it's exactly the kind of building you would expect Hitler and Speer to create between them. It still shows considerable signs of damage from the war. We can see shell strikes and shrapnel damage all around. It was up here in his beloved mountains that Hitler felt most at peace. He came to Berchtesgaden and to Obersalzberg, which is above me here. As soon as he had the opportunity, Hitler made his home here in Berchtesgaden. It was where he felt spiritually at ease. The trees and the mountains reminded him of his carefree days when he and his friend Kubizek would tramp round the hills outside Linz. Behind me, to my left here, you can see the extension to the railway station that Hitler had built in the 30s. It was here to Berchtesgaden that he would invite many of his most important guests, and Neville Chamberlain famously came here in the prelude to the Second World War. Much later, for his 50th birthday, Hitler was presented with the magnificent property at Obersalzberg, which took him even higher up into the mountains and is now commonly referred to as the Eagle's Nest, although that's not a term that was used at the time of the Third Reich. All the traces of Hitler's house have long gone. The Allies took a decision that they would eradicate every last trace of the Führer. And his name is certainly no longer celebrated around here. Interestingly, the Eagle's Nest, the house he received for his 50th birthday, is now increasingly a tourist attraction. It seems that people want to understand something of the cataclysmic events that took place in the 20th century, and I think that's fairly understandable. Hitler had a very strange attitude towards work. He was very much a dilettante. He liked to sleep long into the day, and what work he did, he tended to do in the hours of darkness. It drove his staff mad because they had to be up in the day and carrying out his orders. Hitler was a very, very strange person in so many respects. He loved to spend time, for example, watching movies rather than deal with the affairs of the state. If it was possible to put off a task, then that's what Hitler would do. And coming here to the Bavarian Alps was typical of Hitler in many respects, because he liked to do the absolute minimal. We know from Hanisch, Hitler's companion in the men's shelter from his days of struggle in Vienna, that Hitler took as much leisure time as he possibly could. This is one of the most sinister surviving sites from the time of the Third Reich. This is Mauthausen. It has a notorious reputation even among the concentration lager. So that says something about just how awful the experience was to be incarcerated here. And it's here that the inmates would be called twice daily to answer roll call. This is the small courtyard, it's described, and there are many surviving pictures of people standing here under guard from guards in the tower with machine guns. This is the prison block at Mauthausen, but it's very typical of literally thousands of sites like this all over Germany and the Third Reich. And as Hitler's empire expanded, so too did these depressing edifices. The SS and the Gestapo, of course, were completely out of control and answered to no one. There was no court of appeal or judge, and in order to get information or merely for the sake of it, they would beat their victims and then throw them into cells, even with broken bones, to lie and wallow in self-pity. This was the real mechanism of how Hitler planned to maintain his power. He would throw his opponents into places like this and simply lock them up. Nacht and Nebel, night and fog, was the concept whereby people would simply disappear into the system and would never be seen again. It was to this spot behind me that Hitler was drawn in June of 1940. He was fresh from the successful signing of the armistice in the forest of Compiègne, and he came here with a small entourage to celebrate what to many appeared like a crowning victory. One of the things that was on Hitler's mind at the time when he made the trip here to the Eiffel Tower was whether or not to proceed with a victory parade through Paris. And it's quite telling, really, that Hitler took the decision not to go ahead with the parade, because at the time he justified that decision by in the words that the job was not yet finished. I think Hitler knew that although this may appear to be the high water mark, it was by no means a conclusive victory here in the West. It was a stunning victory. In May and June, the forces of both the British Expeditionary Force and the French National Army had both collapsed. But it wasn't, of course, a complete victory. The English Channel stood between Hitler and the UK, and as we all know, he was never able to bridge that gap. So this is the exact spot where Hitler came to bask in his moment of triumph. He stood at the low wall behind me and reflected on the Eiffel Tower. He was accompanied by a film crew, and the film photographer squatted down on his haunches to get the famous shot of Hitler and the tower. He was also accompanied by Albert Speer, his famous architect, because Hitler still considered himself an architect at heart, and he revelled in the beauty of the city, as so many tourists do today. For Hitler, one of the most important buildings in Paris, the Opera House. He was such a passionate devotee of opera by 1940 that it was the one place he really wanted to spend a considerable amount of time. Hitler was sufficiently astute to know that the victory wasn't by any means complete. He considered it finishing the job because Britain stood alone and was very much on its knees. But onto the stage had come this other maverick, Winston Churchill, and Churchill was equally dogged and determined to achieve an aim at all costs. And he too was a gambler, and he took enormous gambles in his quest to defeat Adolf Hitler, and it's thankful for all of us that Churchill succeeded.
What General Weygand has called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit upland. But if we fail, then the whole world will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
In a way, it's a grander echo of what happened in 1914. The Germans were able to enjoy a huge initial success on a far greater scale than the Schlieffen Plan had ever envisaged. And by 1941, they were in command of all of continental Europe, up to and including the Greek islands, and they were already established in North Africa. So that may appear to be the military highlight for Hitler, but politically, Hitler lost the initiative in 1938, because once the Allies had taken the decision to oppose Hitler with military force, although things initially were very good for Hitler, ultimately the initiative had gone. By 1944, Paris was again in Allied hands, and this was a hugely significant event. On the Eastern Front, an unbroken string of Soviet victories was pointing towards the eventual fall of Berlin. And also in July 1944, there had been the attempt on Hitler's life. So by August 1944, it was clear that it was only a matter of time before the fall of the National Socialist regime. As the last remnants of the Wehrmacht attempted to disentangle themselves from Paris, there was a popular uprising which saw some bloody street fighting, and the city itself was sufficiently freed to be able to welcome the incoming Free French troops with open arms.
On the Russian front, things go from bad to worse. German troops are driven from Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The next Russian move will be into the German heartland. German troops bravely face the massive Russian attacks with the inevitable results when troops are outmanned and outgunned and hungry and cold. You never see a ghost step in the snow. Disaster follows disaster. The Allies storm across France and double their aerial assaults on Germany itself. German troops are surrendering now by the thousands. The white flags of surrender are fluttering everywhere. The GIs pull down the swastika and run up the stars and stripes. So be it, Hitler tells himself. If the Third Reich must fall, let it be to the Americans. But even this is not to be. There has been a deal at Yalta. The British and Americans are to draw up along the Elbe and let the Russians take Berlin. Hitler sees the handwriting on the wall. He must go to Berlin to turn the rout into victory or fall in the attempt. And so he and Eva Braun go there and install themselves in the Chancellery. There he screams for greater sacrifices.
We've come here to the very centre of Berlin. Behind me is the Brandenburg Gate, which was built in 1791 and was a symbol of Prussian power. Although Hitler had shown great courage during the First World War, at this point of the Second World War, his crimes had become so immense and so monstrous that he knew there was only one way out. Very close to here is Wilhelmstrasse, where Hitler's bunker was located. And as the Russians closed in, he married Eva Braun, and then both committed suicide.
He says, I entered his bedroom in the bunker with him. On the table there was a 7.5 pistol. He went up to it. I got a terrible shock. He cocked the gun. But no, it wasn't the last hour yet. He was only making sure it was loaded. A few days later, the event took place, which I thought was going to happen at that moment.
In order to ensure that there was no body for the Russians to discover, Hitler and Eva's remains were placed in a shell hole, sprinkled with some of the little remaining stocks of petrol and set on fire. Hitler had taken the coward's way out. He didn't have the courage to face up to the consequences of his monstrous crimes.
He says, "When I saw the chief for the last time, I definitely had the feeling that the end was near. But there was no change in him that you could see, not in his character nor anything else. He said goodbye and dismissed me. Next day, when the chief was dead, I went on to the bunker just as they were carrying out the corpse. Then came Martin Bormann with Eva Braun in his arms. I took her body away from him and carried her along behind Adolf Hitler. We placed these two bodies side by side in the garden. I had placed on me the exceptionally difficult moral duty of pouring petrol on them and setting fire to them. The corpses burned from 1:30 until 7:30 in the evening."
And behind me is the memorial to those who suffered under the genocide which was perpetrated against the Jewish race. It's a very evocative and very emotional experience because, as you can see, the sculptor has chosen to represent the suffering in the form of thousands of silent and unmarked coffins. Of course, the people who suffered at the hands of Hitler's regime weren't afforded the decency of a burial in a coffin. So it's fitting that now there is at least something here that recalls how they suffered. But it's a measure of just how evil this regime was, that the suffering of these people was only a part of what happened under Hitler's regime. Throughout Nazi-occupied Europe, terrible atrocities were perpetrated in Norway, in Denmark, in France, in Greece, in the Balkans. Right throughout Europe we saw monstrous crimes committed, and the Jewish Holocaust is only one part of that, and it's quite hard to comprehend that all of these deaths weren't actually equivalent to the whole of the crime. The crimes were so enormous and so monstrous, and it wasn't until Nuremberg in 1946 that the world began to get a glimpse of just how much suffering there had also been, for example, in the French population, who had suffered terribly with people being taken into slave labour and transported here in Germany to work on behalf of the Reich. One feels that he should have had the courage of his convictions to stand up at Nuremberg and be counted. Whether he would have been allowed the dignity of a trial which he denied to so many is a moot point, especially if he'd fallen into Russian hands. All around him was the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, and Hitler felt that this was a just fate to be visited on the German population. He felt that if they weren't sufficiently strong to win the war and to win the war for National Socialism, then German society didn't deserve to go on and live. It's typical of Hitler's warped creed. the big concern here in Germany, of course, is that if you leave these monuments, they'll become a kind of a shrine or someplace which represents a kind of pilgrimage, and I think that's an understandable fear. But I think that's all it is. It's a fear. Hitler is like Napoleon, he's never coming back. That regime was so much built around the character of one man, and it was very much his vision and his creation. And for that reason, it's never likely to reappear, because you'll never be able to bring Hitler back. Of course, people will say there are other dictators, but these people are very much a product of their circumstance and at the time. And at the time when Hitler was in operation, there was a great deal of sympathy for the racist views that he espoused, which have gone now. It's a modern world. I think we've realised with air travel just how small the world actually is, and you will never ever again be able to look to try and bring back those kind of ideas. It's gone.